The world of celebrity parties is often seen as glamorous, intoxicating, and glittering with the promise of excitement. For a young man named Mark, a security guard who landed a job working high-profile events in New York, these parties were an escape from his mundane life and an entry into a world of opulence he'd only glimpsed on television. When he was assigned to work at some of Sean Diddy Combs' infamous parties in 2010, he thought he'd hit the jackpot. But what started as a thrilling adventure into the lives of the rich and famous turned into a haunting experience he would never forget. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. Mark was a tough, no-nonsense kind of guy who had grown up in a working-class neighborhood. He had a knack for staying calm in chaotic situations and a deep sense of loyalty to his job. His bosses admired his ability to keep a level head when tensions ran high, which made him a perfect fit for high-pressure environments. In early 2010, he was contacted by a private security firm that specialized in elite events. They needed guards for an upcoming party hosted by Diddy, known for his extravagant celebrations that attracted the most influential people in entertainment, sports, and business. Mark eagerly accepted the offer. Mark noticed things that didn't sit right. The laughter grew louder, almost manic. Conversations became more heated. He overheard snippets of arguments laced with veiled threats. Some guests stumbled past him, their eyes wide and glassy, muttering incoherently. At one point, a man dressed in an immaculate suit approached Mark, gripping his arm tightly. "Don't go downstairs," the man whispered, his breath smelling of expensive whiskey. Before Mark could ask what he meant, the man disappeared into the crowd. Later that night, Mark's curiosity got the better of him. While making his rounds, he ventured toward a staircase leading to the basement. The air grew colder as he descended, the noise from the party above fading into an eerie silence. He reached a heavy door and peered inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. The room was dimly lit, with a long table in the center surrounded by people wearing elaborate masks. Their laughter was hollow, their movements jerky and unnatural. At the head of the table sat a man who looked eerily familiar, though Mark couldn't place him. On the table were items that Mark could only describe as ritualistic: candles, symbols drawn in red, and objects he couldn't identify but gave off a sinister energy. One of the masked figures turned and looked directly at Mark. Though the mask obscured their face, Mark felt an intense, almost predatory gaze pierce through him. Panicking, he stumbled back upstairs, his heart racing. When he returned to the main party, the glamour and noise felt like a fever dream. He didn't tell anyone what he'd seen, fearing he'd lose his job or worse. The second party was even more extravagant, held in a private mansion outside the city. Mark tried to shake off the unease from the previous event, convincing himself he'd imagined things. But as the night unfolded, he realized there was a dark undercurrent to these gatherings. Guests whispered cryptic remarks about making deals and paying the price. Mark saw a famous actor storm out of a room, tears streaming down his face, while a group of people inside laughed cruelly. A model collapsed in the hallway, her body trembling as she muttered incoherent phrases about shadows and the man with the golden eyes. Mark's duties often required him to patrol the perimeter of the property, which brought its own set of horrors. On one occasion, he spotted what he thought was a person standing in the distance, just beyond the glow of the outdoor lights. As he approached, the figure vanished into the trees, leaving behind an overwhelming sense of dread. Another time, he heard faint music coming from an area that was supposed to be off-limits. Following the sound, he found a small group gathered around a fire pit, their faces illuminated by the flames. They were chanting softly, their voices blending in a way that felt otherworldly. When one of them noticed Mark, the chanting stopped abruptly, and the group dispersed without a word. The nightmares began shortly after. Mark would wake up drenched in sweat, haunted by visions of masked figures and shadowy silhouettes. He saw the man with the golden eyes in his dreams, his gaze burning into Mark's soul. Sleep became a luxury he could no longer afford. During the day, he tried to rationalize his experiences, but the sense of unease lingered. He began noticing strange coincidences, lights flickering in his apartment, unfamiliar faces watching him from across the street, and cryptic notes slipped under his door that read, "Stay silent." As the clock struck 12, the lights dimmed, and the room was bathed in an unnatural red glow. Mark watched in horror as the man with the golden eyes appeared at the center of the room, his presence commanding and otherworldly. The guests froze, their faces blank and expressionless, as if they were under a spell. The man spoke, his voice resonating with a power that made Mark's bones vibrate. Though Mark couldn't understand the words, he felt their meaning deep within. Submission, power, and an unrelenting darkness. Mark knew he couldn't stay any longer. He left his post and slipped out of the mansion, his heart pounding. He never returned to the security firm and spent the following months trying to rebuild his life. But the nightmares persisted, and the man with the golden eyes continued to haunt him. Years later, Mark shared his story anonymously, hoping to find closure. He spoke of the darkness that lurked behind the glittering facade of celebrity life and the toll it took on those who dared to look too closely. Some dismissed his claims as the ramblings of a disgruntled employee or the product of an overactive imagination, but others believed him, recognizing the same darkness he described in their own encounters with the world of the elite. Mark's experiences at Diddy's parties in 2010 were more than just a series of unsettling events. They were a glimpse into a reality most people could never fathom. Whether it was the result of drugs, alcohol, or something far more sinister, Mark would never know. But one thing was certain. The nightmares he saw at those parties would stay with him forever. Mark's world unraveled in ways he couldn't have anticipated after leaving the security firm. The man he was before those nights at the Diddy parties was gone, replaced by someone who felt perpetually on edge, hunted by memories too vivid to ignore. He relocated to a smaller town upstate, hoping to escape the shadows of New York City. Yet the darkness followed him, as if tethered to his soul. He spent hours searching the internet for explanations, using keywords like elite rituals, celebrity cults, and hidden societies. What he found only deepened his paranoia. Forums filled with anonymous users shared accounts of eerie encounters, secret handshakes, and strange symbols etched into the periphery of Hollywood glamour. Some posts described gatherings similar to what Mark had witnessed, a strange blend of debauchery and ceremonial acts that hinted at a darker purpose. He came across blurry photos of gatherings, grainy enough to cast doubt but compelling enough to confirm he wasn't alone in what he had seen. Yet none of it offered comfort. If anything, it made him feel even more isolated. Mark began to hear a recurring sound, soft whispers just at the edge of his hearing. It wasn't like the normal hum of life. These whispers carried distinct words, some in English and others in a language he didn't recognize but instinctively feared. They seemed to emanate from nowhere, yet everywhere. The creak of his floorboards, the rustle of the wind through his apartment window, or the faint hum of a passing car. The whispers weren't constant but frequent enough to unsettle him, especially when they came late at night. One evening, while walking home from a part-time job at a local hardware store, Mark felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. It was winter, and the cold bit through his jacket. The town was quiet except for the crunch of his boots on the snow-covered sidewalk. He stopped and turned, expecting to see nothing. But standing beneath a flickering street lamp was a figure. Their face was obscured by a hood, but their stance was unmistakably intentional. Mark froze, his breath visible in the icy air. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, a silent testament to his growing paranoia, or he feared the reality of his situation. Mark turned away and walked faster, his heart pounding. When he dared to glance back, the figure was gone. But the sense of unease lingered, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. He began to notice other peculiarities. The same black car parked outside his apartment for hours on end, people in restaurants who seemed too interested in him, and unfamiliar voices on the other end of the phone when he picked up. He started to question if it was paranoia or something far more deliberate. Desperate for answers, Mark reached out to someone he thought might help, a journalist named Claire who specialized in investigative reporting on powerful elites. He had read her exposés on the hidden machinations of the rich and famous and admired her ability to uncover stories no one else dared to touch. He emailed her using a burner account, detailing everything he had seen at the parties. He didn't hold back. The masked figures, the rituals, the man with the golden eyes, and the pervasive sense of dread. Claire responded quickly, her curiosity clearly piqued. She agreed to meet him at a small diner outside town, a neutral and public place where they could talk without drawing too much attention. When Mark arrived, she was already there, sipping coffee and reviewing notes. She was younger than he expected, with an intensity in her eyes that made it clear she took her work seriously. As Mark recounted his experiences, Claire listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. She asked pointed questions, probing for details he hadn't thought to include in his email. "Did you notice any specific symbols on the masks or objects in the room?" she asked. Mark described a recurring motif, a circle with interlocking lines that resembled a spider's web. Claire nodded, her expression darkening. "This isn't the first time I've heard of something like this," she said, her voice low. She explained that similar stories had surfaced over the years, always tied to the entertainment industry or the ultra-wealthy. The rituals, the masks, the cryptic language, they all pointed to a secret society known only by whispers, the Eclipsed Order. According to her research, this group operated in the shadows, using their influence to manipulate events on a global scale. They were rumored to be behind scandals, sudden career downfalls, and even unexplained deaths. "What you saw," Claire said, "wasn't just a party. It was an initiation." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. He had been a bystander in something far more sinister than he had imagined. "Why would they let someone like me see that?" he asked. "They didn't let you," Claire replied. "You saw something you weren't supposed to. And if they know that, they won't stop until they've ensured your silence." Her words sent Mark into a tailspin of fear. He realized that leaving the security firm and moving to a quiet town hadn't been enough. Whatever forces he had stumbled upon weren't bound by geography or circumstance. They could find him anywhere. Over the next few weeks, Mark and Claire worked together to piece together the fragments of his experiences. She connected him with other whistleblowers, people who had once been on the inside but had escaped with their lives and their secrets. One of them, a former music producer, shared a chilling account of how he had been coerced into attending a similar event years earlier. "It's not just a party," the man said over the phone, his voice trembling. "It's a transaction. You give them something, loyalty, secrets, power, and they give you everything you've ever wanted. But there's always a price." Mark couldn't help but wonder what price those celebrities had paid to sit at that table. Were they victims, or were they complicit? The thought haunted him. One night, Claire called Mark in a panic. She had been followed on her way home, and her apartment had been ransacked. Her files on the Eclipsed Order were gone, but her computer had been untouched. A clear message that whoever had broken in wasn't after money or valuables. Mark felt the walls closing in. They had poked a hornet's nest, and now the hornets were circling. It was around this time that Mark began seeing the man with the golden eyes again. Not in his dreams, but in the waking world. He would catch fleeting glimpses of him in reflective surfaces. The rearview mirror of his car, the glass of a shop window, even the surface of his coffee. Each time the image would vanish as quickly as it appeared, but the lingering sense of being watched remained. Mark became hypervigilant, jumping at shadows and keeping a weapon within arm's reach at all times. Claire eventually decided to publish an article based on Mark's story, carefully anonymizing the details to protect him. The piece was a bombshell, stirring up controversy and attracting both support and skepticism. Some readers praised her bravery and demanded accountability, while others dismissed the story as conspiracy theory nonsense. But amidst the noise, there were those who seemed to recognize the truth. Anonymous commenters shared cryptic messages of validation. "She's closer than she thinks," "The web tightens," and "They know you're watching." Mark's life took another turn for the worse when he received a package in the mail. Inside was a single object, a mask identical to the ones he had seen in the basement. There was no note, no return address, just the mask and its suffocating implications. Mark knew it was a warning, a reminder that they hadn't forgotten him. Mark froze, his mind racing for an escape plan. But the man didn't move, didn't speak. He simply stared, his golden eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Mark felt an overwhelming sense of despair, as if the man's gaze was pulling him into a void. Summoning every ounce of courage, he shouted, "What do you want from me?" The man's expression didn't change, but Mark heard the answer in his mind. "Your silence." When Mark woke up, the man was gone and the whispers had stopped. But the message was clear. If he valued his life, he would remain quiet. Mark packed his belongings and disappeared, leaving no forwarding address. He cut ties with Claire, though he heard later that she had been hired by a major news outlet and was pursuing stories unrelated to the Eclipsed Order. Whether she had given up or been forced to, Mark didn't know. Years passed, and Mark's life became a mosaic of disconnected places and people. He moved constantly, always wary of staying in one location too long. The trauma of what he had witnessed at those parties and the shadowy forces that had trailed him since kept him in a perpetual state of flight. While the whispers and visions of the man with the golden eyes had grown less frequent, the fear of them returning controlled every decision he made. By now, Mark had become something of a recluse. He avoided forming relationships, unwilling to endanger anyone else. He worked odd jobs that required little interaction. A night janitor, a delivery driver, a groundskeeper at a desolate estate. These roles suited him. Solitude was safer, and in silence he could monitor his surroundings without distraction. He had learned to trust his instincts, to spot signs of surveillance, and to recognize when someone was watching him. One day, while cleaning a library in a small New England town, Mark stumbled across an old book on a dusty shelf in the restricted section. The leather-bound tome bore no title, only an unfamiliar symbol embossed in gold. A circle interwoven with lines, eerily similar to the one he had seen at Diddy's party. His breath caught in his throat. The spine creaked as he opened it, revealing pages filled with dense text in a language he didn't understand. However, interspersed among the cryptic writing were illustrations that made his blood run cold. They depicted masked figures in ritualistic poses, strange ceremonies under the full moon, and shadowy entities with glowing eyes. Mark took the book, tucking it into his jacket despite the risk of being caught. For weeks he pored over its contents, though much of it remained incomprehensible. However, certain pages contained marginal notes in English, written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. These annotations seemed to describe encounters with a secretive organization that bore an uncanny resemblance to the Eclipsed Order. Phrases like ritual hierarchy, binding contract, and sacrificial exchange were scrawled in the margins, along with warnings: do not make eye contact, and escape is temporary. The more Mark studied the book, the more he realized it wasn't just a historical artifact, it was a manual. It outlined the Order's structure, its rituals, and its methods of recruiting or coercing members. The most chilling part was a section dedicated to their enforcers, individuals referred to only as Watchers. These Watchers, according to the text, were tasked with ensuring the Order's secrecy, silencing dissenters, and reclaiming those who tried to escape. One illustration depicted a Watcher in haunting detail, a tall figure with a featureless face except for piercing golden eyes. Mark's hands trembled as he read. He realized the man he had seen, both at the parties and in his visions, wasn't a man at all. He was a Watcher, and his appearance hadn't been a coincidence. The book suggested that once a Watcher marked someone, they were never truly free. The discovery reignited Mark's paranoia. If the Watcher had been assigned to him, why had he been left alone in recent years? Had the Order decided he was no longer a threat, or were they simply waiting for the right moment? Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he was still being watched, that his every move was being cataloged by unseen eyes. In a desperate attempt to understand more, Mark sought out experts who might help him decipher the book. He avoided universities and large institutions, fearing their connections to wealthy benefactors who might be linked to the Order. Instead, he turned to fringe communities, occult researchers, conspiracy theorists, and independent scholars who operated outside traditional systems. Most dismissed the book as a forgery or a curiosity, but one man, an elderly historian named Dr. Victor Hollis, took an immediate interest. Dr. Hollis lived in a secluded cabin deep in the woods, surrounded by shelves overflowing with ancient texts and artifacts. When Mark showed him the book, the historian's face paled. "Where did you get this?" Hollis asked, his voice trembling. Mark hesitated before explaining his experiences, leaving out certain details to protect himself. Hollis listened intently, occasionally glancing at the book as if it might spring to life. When Mark finished, Hollis leaned back in his chair, his expression grave. "This isn't just a book," Hollis said. "It's a key." "A key to what?" Mark asked. "To understanding their power, and perhaps to fighting back." Hollis explained that the Order's rituals were deeply rooted in ancient traditions that predated most organized religions. They weren't simply acts of devotion, they were contracts, binding agreements with entities that existed beyond human comprehension. The symbols and chants described in the book were designed to summon these entities, to harness their power at a cost. "The man with the golden eyes you keep seeing," Hollis said, "isn't a man. He's a conduit, a watcher between worlds." Mark shuddered. "How do I stop him? How do I stop them?" Hollis's expression darkened. "Stopping them isn't an option. Surviving them is." Hollis agreed to help Mark decipher the book further, though he warned it would be dangerous. Over the next few weeks, the two men worked tirelessly, unraveling the book's secrets piece by piece. They discovered references to a ritual called the severance, a process that could potentially break a watcher's connection to its target. However, the ritual was perilous, requiring specific conditions: a location of spiritual significance, rare ingredients, and a willing intermediary to act as a buffer between the target and the watcher. As they prepared for the ritual, strange things began to happen. Hollis's cabin was ransacked one night, though nothing was stolen. Mark's phone, which he kept off and hidden, began receiving calls from unknown numbers. When he answered once out of desperation, all he heard was heavy breathing followed by a chilling whisper: "You can't run!" They chose an abandoned church deep in the woods as the site for the ritual. Hollis believed the church's history as a place of worship, now long forgotten, would amplify their chances of success. They gathered the necessary ingredients: herbs, candles, and a vial of blood from a rare animal that Hollis insisted was crucial. Mark was skeptical, but followed Hollis's instructions to the letter. The night of the ritual was cold and moonless. The church was eerily silent, its crumbling walls casting jagged shadows in the flickering candlelight. Hollis stood in the center of the room, reciting chants from the book in a language that made Mark's skin crawl. Mark sat in a circle of symbols drawn with chalk and blood, his heart pounding as the air grew thick with tension. Then the temperature dropped. The candles flickered violently before snuffing out entirely, plunging the room into darkness. Mark heard a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. When his eyes adjusted to the dark, he saw him, the Watcher, standing at the edge of the circle, his golden eyes glowing like embers. Hollis shouted for Mark to stay inside the circle no matter what happened. The historian continued chanting, his voice trembling but resolute. The Watcher stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. Mark felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if his very soul was being pulled toward the figure. The ritual reached its climax as Hollis threw the vial of blood into the center of the circle, causing a burst of light that momentarily blinded Mark. When his vision cleared, the Watcher was gone. The oppressive weight in the air lifted and the room fell silent once more. Hollis collapsed to the floor, exhausted but alive. "It's done," he said weakly. "You're free." But Mark wasn't so sure. Though the Watcher had disappeared, the sense of being watched never fully left him. Hollis assured him that the ritual had severed the connection, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the order wasn't finished with him yet. Mark left the cabin the next morning, thanking Hollis for his help and promising to stay in touch. But deep down, he knew there was no going back to a normal life. The order had marked him, and even if the Watcher was gone, the memories and the fear would remain forever. As he drove away from the woods, Mark glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, he thought he saw a pair of glowing golden eyes staring back at him. But when he blinked, they were gone. Whether it was his imagination or a reminder of the order's reach, Mark couldn't tell. All he knew was that he couldn't stop running, not yet. Mark's journey after the ritual was one of constant vigilance. Though Dr. Hollis had reassured him that the connection to the Watcher had been severed, Mark found it impossible to believe in absolutes anymore. His survival instincts, sharpened by years of fear and paranoia, wouldn't allow him to relax. The echoes of what he had witnessed and endured were too deeply ingrained, and each day was a battle to reclaim his sense of autonomy. He moved again, this time heading west to a desert town that felt as remote as possible without entirely disconnecting from society. It was a town of forgotten gas stations, dilapidated motels, and long stretches of open road. The emptiness of the landscape appealed to him. It offered fewer places for someone, or something, to hide. He rented a small trailer on the outskirts, far enough from neighbors to avoid prying eyes, but close enough to feel the faint security of human proximity. One night, while sitting on the steps of his trailer, he saw something unusual in the distance, a faint light flickering on the horizon. It wasn't the headlights of a car, or the steady glow of a distant building. It was irregular, almost like a signal. Mark felt an inexplicable pull toward it, a gnawing curiosity that fought against his better judgment. He decided to investigate, telling himself it was just a passing anomaly. The trek was long and arduous, the desert sand shifting beneath his boots as he trudged toward the light. As he drew closer, he realized the light came from a small bonfire. Around it sat 3 figures, their faces obscured by scarves and hats against the cold night air. They didn't seem startled by his approach, nor did they make any move to acknowledge him until he was close enough to see the faint shimmer of their eyes reflecting the firelight. "Been waiting for you," one of them said, their voice raspy and low. Mark froze. His heart raced as his mind scrambled to make sense of the situation. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice firmer than he felt. "We're not enemies," the figure continued. "We've been following your path. You've seen them, haven't you? The Order? The Watchers?" Mark's throat tightened. He wanted to run, but found himself rooted to the spot. "What do you know about them?" The figure gestured for him to sit, and though every instinct told him to flee, he complied. Over the next hour, they revealed themselves as part of a hidden resistance, a network of individuals who had spent their lives studying and opposing the Order. They had read the same book Mark had uncovered, studied its implications, and tried to unravel the secrets of the Order's power. "You've survived something few others have," another figure said. "That makes you important." Mark didn't know whether to trust them, but their knowledge ran deep, and their understanding of the rituals and symbols mirrored his own experience. For the first time, he felt he wasn't entirely alone in his fight. They spoke of methods to evade detection, ways to protect oneself from Watchers, and the possibility, however slim, of dismantling the Order's influence. When Mark finally returned to his trailer that night, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. Though the fear remained, it was tempered by a growing resolve. He wasn't running anymore. Not entirely. Now, he was planning. Mark's return to the trailer that night marked a turning point. A subtle shift from perpetual flight to cautious determination. For years, he had moved like a shadow, staying one step ahead of unseen forces. But now, armed with the knowledge shared by the Resistance, he began to consider a new possibility, facing the darkness head-on. It wasn't courage exactly, it was necessity. Running had only carried him so far, and the burden of his fear had become unbearable. The desert, once a place of eerie silence and isolation, now felt like a crucible where Mark could forge himself into something stronger. He began to prepare, though for what he wasn't entirely sure. Each day he practiced routines designed to sharpen his awareness and self-reliance. He created escape routes around the trailer, burying supplies in hidden caches and memorizing paths through the arid landscape. He fashioned makeshift traps near the perimeter of his property, not because he expected anyone to come, but because it gave him a sense of control in an uncontrollable world. The Resistance members had spoken of the Order's greatest strength, their ability to sow doubt and fear. They operated in whispers and shadows, convincing their targets they were omnipotent, but Mark understood now that they weren't infallible. The Order thrived on compliance, on the willingness of their victims to accept their power as absolute. The Resistance believed that if enough people stood against them, the Order's carefully constructed mystique could begin to unravel. Mark's nights became a blend of research and training. He revisited the book he had taken from the library, cross-referencing its cryptic passages with the information shared by the Resistance. Slowly, a pattern emerged. A map of sorts, though incomplete, that hinted at the Order's movements and influence. He traced lines between cities, events, and figures, noting where the Order's presence seemed strongest. New York, Los Angeles, London, these hubs were obvious. But there were also quieter places, isolated retreats and small towns where whispers of strange occurrences suggested the Order's hidden workings. One entry in the book caught his attention. It described a location known as the Silent Spire, a place said to hold significant power for the Order. The Resistance had mentioned it briefly, warning that it was both a sanctuary and a trap. According to the book, the Spire was a site where rituals were conducted to renew the Watchers' connection to their targets. Mark wondered if severing that connection permanently might deal a blow to the Order itself. His curiosity grew into resolve. If he could find the Spire, he might find answers, or at least confront the source of his nightmares. The thought terrified him, but it also lit a spark within him that hadn't existed for years. He knew it was reckless, perhaps suicidal, but the alternative, living as prey, was no longer an option. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on the nightmares security witnessed at Diddy's 2010 parties? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.